back here in the museum. We're in front of the section which deals with the Minsk agreements, which sought to resolve the crisis. And of course, they've been widely ignored by the Russians. And that's why we're ending up in this situation we are today. Our next guest has, well, a number of things to say, but also an insight into what President Zelensky might be thinking. Yulia Mendel, great to meet you. Thank you for joining us. You were, of course, the attaché de presse, the press secretary of Vladimir Zelensky. At this present moment in time, can you give us any insight into what might be going on in his head?
Well, Mark, first of all, thank you for having me. And we all were watching the president's conference today, press conference today. And I must say, when I was working with him, I saw him multiple times in crisis. And I know during crisis, he works 24/7 and he gives all of himself towards this crisis. He's very demanding to himself. And imagine that this is the crisis that has been ongoing already for a year. And definitely this is very physically exhausting. But also I know that this is the person that never gives up. I remember his wife, Olena Zelenska, once said that he's a very persistent person. He never gives up. And this is exactly why Ukraine is lucky today to have such a leader who leads us in war against the biggest, autocracy, the most aggressive autocracy today. And he will not give up.
One of the things that you mention in your book, Fight of Our Lives, which is a great summary of your time, but also the run-up to this war and what's happening right now, is the issue of corruption in Ukraine. It's something you're very open about, and it's refreshing to hear someone talk so openly about that. In the next phase of what happens, the rebuilding of Ukraine, the refurbishment, the expansion, how important is it to get that corruption thing really suppressed and try to get rid of it?
When I was thinking how to name the book, the fight of our lives came up to my mind, not only just the fight as a war. It's also the fight for democracy here inside the country. It's the fight for the reforms to join the European Union. And of course, it's the fight against corruption, because I myself was doing this in multiple ways. And there were definitely cases of corruption that were mentioned and that were big scandals around the world. They were mentioned in many media this year. But let me say, it's very difficult for such a country as Ukraine, a country in war, a post-Soviet country, to recognize that we have corruption. But corruption exists around the world. Perhaps, only such countries as Russia can say we don't have any corruption. But we do know they do have, right? And it was very difficult for us. We know that someone can accuse us. But you should understand that we want to admit our mistakes to show that we want to be different country. We want to be transparent country. We want to be really European Union country. And for this, we need to admit mistakes. And we need actually to maintain this issue, to become as much transparent as possible.
Yulia, there is much more to talk about. But on this issue of corruption, I'd like to go now to a man that I met a day ago. His job will be to basically direct the refurbishment, as he calls it, of Ukraine after the war. But of course, it begins right now. I met him on the Maidan Square. Let's take a look at our conversation. We're here on Maidan Square in Kyiv with Mustafa Nazarov. Mustafa is the head of the Agency of Restoration for Ukraine. You were very prominent in the original Maidan demonstrations in 2013, right here, which began the whole process. Did you ever imagine you'd be at this stage, at war?
Of course not. We didn't expect that moment. Now I understand that it was something very natural, because for me it was start of our fight for freedom, that moment. Historically, it is not something which happened that day. I think this day was prepared for centuries, because Ukraine is the longest period of independence we have now. During many centuries, many empires around us tried to occupy Ukraine, and it was start of the fight for freedom. And that moment, we didn't feel that will be so huge changes in our country and around our country in the world.
The estimated damage to the country so far, $138 billion. But you're in charge of restoring Ukraine. How did you begin that? You're still at war, aren't you?
Actually, that's the point, that we are now talking about restoration. We are talking about survival stage of the restoration. And we should do everything now to restore our critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, not to stop all our cargoes for the front line for people. And from the other side, that we was affected our energy sector, energy grid, huge, tremendously, last 4 months. So for this year, we'll focus on the critical infrastructure, roads and bridges, and electricity grid, and building up shelters for our electricity, and of course the residential areas, because many people lost their houses. But I think in the future we should have big strategy and plan to rebuild country, rebuild it better than what we had before, because we don't want to rebuild again Soviet Union. We need expertise for that, we need money for that, and of course we need people who can come and help us with this. From the other side, I see how many people now want to help us. You can't even imagine how many people doing themselves what they can do on the local level and the central level. So for us, this moment is just a moment to focus all our efforts to survive and to fight and to win.
Mustafa, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mustafa Naim, who I spoke to on the Maidan Square, he, as we just heard, was one of the original people protesting back in 2013. And Yulia, of course, as you know, that's what led to, in many ways, the situation we're in today, with Ukraine actually standing up for itself, forcing out a corrupt pro-Russian president. And then the whole thing just seemed to sort of spiral and go further down and further down. The West, I think it's fair to say, didn't stand by Ukraine in 2014. Why do you think that was?
Well, I think they stood, but they had their limits, and definitely it was not enough. If it were enough, then we wouldn't have this large-scale invasion and all those atrocities here right now. But we hope that now the West and actually the civilized world sees what Russia is. Russia covered its face very well with disinformation and propaganda.
Well, that's one of the issues, isn't it? And you deal with it in your book very, very, very well, I think. The fact that there are these ways of using social media to manipulate many situations. We've seen it in the US election, the French election, the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom, and of course, in relation to what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine.
So, look, Russia is a golden champion of lies and propaganda. And Ukraine was a testing platform for all its instruments. So Russia was very generously making this hybrid war, actually, using word as a weapon. And first what Russia did, actually, it's faked journalism, then it faked diplomacy, and now it tries to fake democracy. So for us, it took really a lot of efforts to fight this disinformation, because disinformation is very tasty. Disinformation fakes, they are playing with your emotions, they are playing with your fears, they make you panic, and also they are very easy, they are very simple. Though when you look on the truth is always more complex, right? And it's like more boring. That's why fakes, they are more attractive, and Russia plays with you and tries to divide the society. And now we see that Russia plays with democracies around the world, and especially in the West, trying to use all those instruments that it used in Ukraine and actually to influence politics in many countries, including France, including the UK, including the United States. So it's very, very important to understand that Russia weaponizes the word, weaponizes information, and to actually, protest against this, to be efficient against this war.
You've actually been face-to-face, as we are now, with Vladimir Putin.
Oh, yeah. Well, it happened in 2019, and that was the only personal meeting of President Zelensky with Putin. And I guess that was the only one, because Putin showed himself as a very weak negotiator. Right now, I can openly say, look, he's the guy who's been for over 20 years in power. He is not used to negotiate. When he sat down there at the table together with Zelensky, with Chancellor Merkel, and with President Macron, and then Zelensky was persistent, and he was very diplomatic, and he tried to negotiate. Putin was lost. He did not own the information. He didn't expect that some novice in politics as Zelensky would own this information. He was asking his advisors all the time about what to do, how to move forward. He looked down. He didn't feel comfortable sitting on the chair. All of Putin showed that he was not comfortable sitting and negotiating. And I think that's why he never met Zelensky again. But also there is another impression. When I saw him and his delegation, I understood that he is the person from the past. He was so outdated. His wording, his moves, his thoughts, they were outdated. And I think everything that he does right now in Ukraine is also all those horrors from the past. The genocidal practices, the World War II practices, the famine that used to be in Ukraine, now he tries to expand it around the world. So this proves that he is from the past. And I hope that such people will not have the future and the influence on the future.
Yulia, we're getting to the final moments of this special program. In terms of the next year ahead for Volodymyr Zelensky, how important is the right move, the right next move?
the President Zelensky and Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian people, we all have the will and we have the determination to stand against this aggressive and unpredictable autocracy to the very end. This is the battle of Goliath and David must win. But the West and the civilized world must understand that the unity is even more important right now than before, because we actually showed that we can win, and the victory, it's not far, but we will not be able to cope alone. So, you know, Ukraine never asks for something that is not necessary. We don't ask for something luxury. We ask to give us the modern weaponry, because this is not the war of spares. So we can win, but please stand with us, because we are not fighting here for the land or for Ukraine. We are fighting here for the freedom and for democracy as it's understood in every part of this civilized world.
Yulia Mendel, former press secretary to President Zelensky, thank you very much indeed for joining us here for our special programme. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, your analysis with us. We appreciate it.